The year was 1716, a year that should have dissolved into dust, forgotten among the countless days of empire, conquest, and blood. Yet buried inside it was a night of fire, a night when the silence of slaves broke into a roar of vengeance. The Caribbean sky was swollen with heat. Even after the sun had drowned itself in the western horizon, the air refused to cool. It hung heavy, thick with the stench of sweat, sugarcane, and something darker. The odor of iron chains rubbed raw against human flesh. On the plantations, torches lined the paths like a trail of burning teeth. Their flickering light revealed the outlines of men and women bent double, spines curved from years of forced labor. Faces gleamed with exhaustion. And somewhere among those thousands of broken silhouettes, one figure carried something far heavier than chains. Her name was Esperanza de Lima, but you would not have known it then. That night, she did not look like a savior, nor a hero. She looked like just another shadow, swallowed by the machinery of empire. Yet behind her eyes burned something the overseers could not see, an ember waiting for air, waiting for fuel, waiting for the right moment to ignite. The soundscape was endless. Cane knives clinked against stone. A whip cracked in the distance, its echo slithering through the humid night like a serpent. From the barracks rose the muffled cough of children, children born into chains, children who would never know freedom unless someone tore the chains apart. Esperanza moved through this world like a ghost. She had learned silence, the kind of silence only the enslaved could master. Silence meant survival. A word spoken at the wrong time, a glance held too long, could end in punishment so brutal that death itself seemed a kindness. Yet silence had also taught her to listen, to notice, to remember. The overseers thought the slaves were too beaten to think, too broken to plan. But Esperanza noticed things, the way the guards drank themselves into stupidity after dark, the way the plantation masters gathered near the furnace where iron was smelted, boasting about their profits and their cruelty as if both were medals of honor. She remembered the sounds of their laughter, the kind of laughter that fed on screams. That laughter was carved into her bones. Somewhere long before the fire, she had stopped being afraid of dying. She had already died piece by piece, with every beating, with every friend who vanished in the night, with every child ripped from their mother's arms. What was left inside her was not life, but something sharper, something waiting. And if the men who owned her could have seen into her mind, they might have recognized that silence for what it truly was, the silence before a storm. The plantations had seen storms before. Hurricanes that ripped the cane from the soil, floods that swallowed entire fields. But the storm brewing now was unlike any they had ever faced. It had a name, and it walked among them, eyes lowered, hands scarred, heart ablaze. Esperanza de Lima. She would not remain silent forever. The first whispers of her plan began like faint ripples across a stagnant pond, invisible but moving outward, growing wider. The whispers said there would be a night. They said fire would swallow the masters. They said screams would drown in the roar of the furnace, but whispers are dangerous things, too loud, and they summon death before its time. Too soft, and they vanish into the air, leaving nothing behind. Esperanza balanced those whispers like a blade on her tongue, careful, patient. And then came the night that would burn its way into history. The coal furnace had always been a place of fear. To the slaves, it was a symbol of pain, a machine that devoured wood and coal, its mouth glowing red, its breath thick with smoke. To the masters, it was a tool of wealth. Iron for shackles, iron for tools, iron for whips. They fed the furnace, and the furnace fed their empire. But no one imagined that one night the furnace would devour them instead. The air that evening was restless. The moon hid behind clouds, as if ashamed to witness what was coming. Crickets stuttered in the grass, their rhythm broken. Even the sea beyond the cane fields seemed to hush, its waves falling softer, as though the ocean itself knew that blood would soon stain its shores. Esperanza felt it too. Every step she took carried the weight of prophecy, as though the earth itself had been waiting for her to move. She carried no weapon, at least none that could be seen. What she carried instead was fury, memory, and the unyielding knowledge that monsters could bleed and monsters could burn. Her hands trembled, but not with fear, with restraint. Because tonight she could not afford to fail, not when so many eyes were watching, not when so many souls were waiting for a sign that freedom was possible. The masters, drunk on their own arrogance, gathered near the furnace. They laughed, voices slurred, as mugs of rum clashed against one another. Their laughter rolled across the night like thunder. Esperanza stood at a distance, watching, every nerve on fire. The furnace glowed brighter than the torches. Its mouth yawned wide, swallowing coal, exhaling sparks into the dark. Each crackle of flame was a whisper of what was to come. The moment was close, closer than any of them knew. And somewhere, deep in the shadows of that furnace's glow, Esperanza's lips parted. No words came out, only a breath. But if the world had been listening, it would have heard what that breath carried. It was not prayer, it was not fear, it was the sound of history about to catch fire. The overseers did not notice her standing there. To them, she was invisible, a shadow stitched into the night. That was their first mistake. They believed invisibility meant weakness. They never understood that it could also mean freedom, freedom to move, to watch, to plan. The men around the furnace raised their mugs again. Rum sloshed over the rims, dark liquid spilling onto the dirt like wasted blood. Their words blurred together in drunken celebration. To them, tonight was no different than any other. Another night of laughter bought with suffering. Another night of gloating built on bones. But the furnace knew. The furnace had been waiting. Its fire snapped louder than usual, sparks spitting out into the black air like messengers, like warnings. Its red glow pulsed as if it had a heartbeat of its own, a hungry, waiting hunger. Esperanza felt it. She felt it in her ribs, the way the glow seemed to throb with her own pulse. The furnace was alive, and tonight it was not a servant to the masters. Tonight it would become her ally. She glanced at the others. They were waiting too, the men and women who had trusted her whispers, who had chosen to believe that she could lead them into the unthinkable. Their eyes gleamed in the dark, not with fear but with something sharper. Hope disguised as rage. Rage disguised as silence. Her heart pounded like a drum. Not because she doubted herself. No, her decision had been sealed long ago. She had lived too many nights of screams, too many mornings of chains biting into her wrists. Tonight was not about decision. Tonight was about destiny. And yet, the smallest part of her hesitated, not because she feared punishment. She had already endured the worst of that, but because she knew what fire did. Fire was merciless. It did not choose between guilty and innocent. It consumed everything. If she unleashed it now, she would become both executioner and monster. And though she felt no pity for the men who had crushed lives for profit, she still understood what it meant to hold such power. Her breath came sharp, quick. She closed her eyes, if only for a moment, and saw faces. Faces of the ones who had been taken from her. Faces screaming, faces silent, faces never seen again. She saw her child. Small hands she had once held, a laugh that had been stolen. That memory burned hotter than the furnace itself. When she opened her eyes again, the hesitation was gone. The air grew heavier. The torches flickered as if shrinking from what they sensed. The overseers laughed louder, too loud, as though mocking the night itself. Their words blurred into one another, cruel songs about slaves who died too slowly, about profits that grew too quickly, and Esperanza stepped forward. The first step was the hardest. It echoed inside her chest like the sound of a door unlocking. The second step was easier. By the third, she was no longer walking. She was moving with inevitability like a tide, like a shadow pulled toward flame. Her allies watched, breathless, waiting for the signal. It was not a word, not a gesture. It was the very fact that she moved. That was enough. The furnace roared. The overseers did not notice her until she was close, too close. One of them turned, laughter half-formed in his mouth. His eyes widened. He saw not just a woman, not just a slave, but something else. Something vast and terrible, as though the fire itself had stepped out of the furnace and taken shape. And before he could call out, before his hand could reach for the whip at his side, the night split open. Esperanza's voice, sharp as steel, cut through the drunken haze. It was not a scream, not a cry. It was a command. A single word, spat like fire, one the others had been waiting for. The shadows behind her surged forward. Silent no longer, hands grabbed, bodies lunged. The drunken masters staggered, confused, mouths gaping like fish hauled from water. Their laughter died. In its place came shouts, curses, fists slamming against flesh. And the furnace waited. Its mouth stretched wide, glowing brighter with each passing second, as though it knew its feast was coming. The dawn never broke gently on the plantations. It tore itself across the horizon like a wound opening, blood-orange skies spilling light over endless rows of cane. The stalks swayed in the humid wind, whispering like knives brushing against each other, and within those rows bent and broken figures moved, shackled hands, bent backs, cracked whips. The land was alive with sound, the hiss of machetes cutting cane, the guttural commands of overseers, the hollow moans of men and women, too weary to lift their blades. But among the thousands of voices drowned in sweat and pain, one name began to rise. A name muttered softly, carried like a secret, whispered with a kind of reverence and danger. Esperanza. She had been born into chains. But she never truly belonged to them, the child of fire. Her mother, they said, was a woman who had once led an escape, caught in the mountains, dragged back half dead, and punished until her skin carried more scars than flesh. Her father? No one knew for certain. Some whispered he had been a rebel too, hanged from the great oak by the overseer's orders. Others whispered darker things, that he had been a master himself, spilling his cruelty into the womb of a slave. But Esperanza never cared for the truth. She only knew what her mother told her before death took her. The fire lives in you. Do not let them quench it. Those words stayed with her. Through the endless days of cutting cane, through nights where the sound of the whip echoed in her dreams, through the smell of burning flesh when punishments were carried out. Fire. Always fire. Even as a child, the overseers feared her eyes, too bright, too steady, too unwilling to look away. The plantation masters. The plantation owners, rich men from Europe with velvet waistcoats and powdered wigs, saw their land as kingdoms and themselves as gods. To them, the enslaved were not people, but tools, numbers to be counted, backs to be broken, bodies to be sold. They built their wealth on sugar and blood, on ships heavy with cane and coffins alike. 14 men in particular ruled over this valley, 14 masters whose names would one day burn into ash. Each of them carried sins so heavy the land itself seemed poisoned by their presence. One flayed the skin from runaways and nailed it to the gate. Another kept chains not of iron but of gold to mock the people he owned. Some forced children into the cane rows before their bodies could even lift a blade. Others hunted the pregnant women, laughing as they fell, their unborn ripped from them by hunger and work. Esperanza saw it all. She endured it all, and she remembered. The spark of defiance, unlike many, Esperanza did not bow her head. Her back carried scars, yes, but never the weight of submission. She worked, she bled, she starved, but her eyes remained unbroken. The overseers hated it, the masters feared it. More than once she was dragged to the post, whipped until skin and blood ran together. More than once they thought they had broken her. But every time she rose again. And every time she rose, others whispered her name, Esperanza, hope. At night, by the dying fires, her people would gather in secret. They told stories of freedom, stories of spirits, stories of fire that could not be contained. She listened. She learned. She spoke in low tones, her words igniting something dangerous in the darkness. She told them what they already felt in their bones, that chains could be shattered, that the masters were not gods, that blood could burn hotter than sugar. Her voice became the spark. The furnace at the center of the plantation ground stood a furnace, massive, iron-bellied, always burning. It was used to refine the cane, to boil the juice into crystal sugar. To the masters, it was wealth. To the enslaved, it was terror. Many had been thrown into it alive, men who had resisted, women who had defied, children who had spoken out of turn. The furnace devoured them all. Esperanza had watched its smoke curl into the sky since childhood, watched the red glow flicker against the night like an unholy altar. She never forgot the sound, the shrieks swallowed by fire, the cheers of drunk overseers, and deep inside her something formed. Not fear, not despair, but a vow. One day this furnace would not consume her people. One day it would consume the masters instead, the first blood. The revolt did not begin with drums or banners. It began with a blade in the dark. One night, while the masters feasted in their halls, silver plates gleaming, wine spilling, the enslaved gathered in silence. Esperanza stood at the front, her eyes steady, her hands clenched around a cane knife. She spoke no long speech. She only said, "We are already dead. Tonight, we burn alive." The words chilled them, yet stirred them, because they understood. Living in chains was no life at all. Death with fire was freedom. The first strike came before dawn. Overseers fell, with their throats cut. Dogs were poisoned, gates unbarred, and the fire, always the fire, spread from hut to hut, licking the cane, consuming the night. But this was only the beginning. Esperanza was not satisfied with overseers. She wanted the masters. She wanted the men who had laughed while her people screamed in the furnace. She wanted them to feel what the enslaved had felt. She wanted their skin to blister. She wanted their lungs to choke. She wanted them to beg for mercy in a place where no mercy lived, and so she led them not away from the plantation, not into hiding, but straight to the furnace. The gathering storm word spread quickly among the enslaved of nearby plantations. Some ran to join her, carrying nothing but their rage. Others fled in fear, terrified of the punishment that would follow. But those who stayed with Esperanza were bound not by chance but by fire. They armed themselves with machetes, stones, even their chains. They sang no songs, raised no banners. They carried silence, heavy and thick, broken only by the crackle of flames as cane fields burned. And Esperanza, her eyes glowing in the firelight, led them like a figure from prophecy. Some swore later that she did not walk, but seemed carried by the flames themselves, her shadow long and sharp, her face lit by an otherworldly glow. And when she spoke, even the fire seemed to hush. They made us ashes. Tonight, we make them ashes too. Foreshadow of terror. The 14 masters laughed when they first heard of the revolt. They called it a tantrum, a fit of savages too foolish to know their place. They sent more overseers, more muskets, confident that their wealth, their guns, their God would shield them. But as the days passed, as plantation after plantation burned, their laughter cracked, their slaves disappeared, their fields turned to ash, their homes shook with the sound of drums in the night. And then, silence. The silence was worse than the fire, because in that silence Esperanza prepared the furnace. Cliffhanger on the final night. The sky turned black with smoke. The 14 masters were dragged, bound in chains of their own making, screaming as the enslaved carried them toward the furnace. They kicked, they spat, they begged. Esperanza walked before them, her face expressionless, her eyes reflecting the furnace's glow. For years, this fire had devoured her people. Tonight, it would feast on their oppressors. She stopped before the furnace doors, the screams of the masters echoing in her ears. Slowly, deliberately, she turned. Her voice was low, but it carried like thunder. This fire remembers you. The doors groaned open, the heat blasted outward. The masters shrieked, the enslaved cheered, and Esperanza, calm, steady, unblinking, raised her hand toward the flames. The fire bent toward her, and then darkness. The night was swollen with heat. A storm churned beyond the horizon, yet no rain dared to fall. Instead, smoke filled the skies, black, endless, suffocating. The cane fields glowed with dying embers, sparks leaping like restless spirits. Through that smoke, 14 figures stumbled, dragged in chains. Their silk clothes torn, powdered wigs blackened, their pale faces streaked with sweat and dirt. They were no longer gods of the land. They were prey. Around them marched a tide of shadows. Men, women, children once bent in servitude, now standing tall, their eyes gleaming with fury. The sound of chains rattled, not as shackles but as weapons. The earth itself seemed to throb. Beneath their bare feet, a drumbeat of vengeance, and at the center of it all walked Esperanza. Silent, steady, her eyes fixed ahead where the furnace roared like the mouth of hell. The procession of fear. The masters whimpered, spat, cursed. One, Lord Marquet, the oldest among them, screamed until his voice cracked. "You beasts, you dare raise hands against us. You are nothing without us. Nothing." His words vanished into the night, drowned by the crackling of flames. Another Don Sebastian tried to bargain. "Gold, wine, women, freedom. I will give you anything, anything you ask." But the crowd only laughed. A dry, broken laughter born of centuries of suffering. For once, the master's words held no power. They were paraded like sacrificial lambs, past the ruins of their cane fields, past the smoldering huts where once they forced children to live, past the oak tree where runaways had hung. Everywhere they looked, their empire lay in ruins, and yet worse awaited them at the furnace. The furnace awakens. The furnace loomed at the plantation's heart, its iron belly glowing red, its smoke spilling upward like a pillar of wrath. It had always burned sugar, always consumed bodies, but tonight it seemed alive. The enslaved gathered in a circle, their chants low, their voices deep. Old songs, forbidden songs, songs that carried the weight of ancestors, the drum of bones, the howl of forgotten gods. As they chanted, the furnace groaned. The iron doors rattled. Sparks spat into the night sky, as though the fire itself hungered. When Esperanza stepped forward, the flames bent toward her, stretching as if to greet her. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some crossed themselves, some fell to their knees, others smiled through tears. Esperanza did not bow. She only whispered, "Low but clear, it is time." The first master burns. The crowd dragged forth Lord Marquet, the one who had nailed the skins of rebels to the gates. His wrinkled face was twisted in rage. "I am your master. You cannot touch me," he bellowed, struggling against the chains. Esperanza looked at him, her face calm, her eyes two coals. "You are ash," she said. The doors of the furnace screamed open. The heat blasted outward, searing skin. Even those in the back of the crowd flinched, covering their faces. The flames leapt higher, brighter, roaring as though they had waited for this moment. Marquet's screams rose with them. He fought, he begged, he cursed, but the crowd forced him forward. His body disappeared into the light, swallowed whole. The fire howled, and when it quieted, silence fell, thick, suffocating. Esperanza raised her hand. 13 remain, one by one. The executions did not come quickly. They came with ritual, with memory, with vengeance. Don Sebastian was next, the man who had kept golden chains for mockery. His ornaments melted first, dripping from his flesh like molten tears before his body followed. Marquis Duval, who had taken children to his bed, shrieked until his tongue burned away. The crowd spat as he was dragged to the furnace. Senor Alvaro, who had hunted pregnant women for sport, was torn with the claws of those same women before he met the fire. Their cries of rage echoed louder than his screams. Each master's crime was spoken aloud by the enslaved before the fire consumed him. Each punishment was not just death, it was testimony. The furnace became a judge, jury, and executioner. Esperanza, its prophet. The masters begged. By the time the 10th master fell, the last 4 were no longer cursing. They were begging. "Mercy. Please, mercy. We are men. We are flesh and blood." Esperanza stepped close. For the first time she smiled. But it was not mercy in her smile. So were we. Her words cut deeper than any blade. The 13th flame, the 13th master, was thrown into the fire. The crowd erupted, their chants shaking the earth. The flames rose higher than ever before, leaping into the black sky like a beacon, but something changed. The fire did not dim after consuming him. It grew. It swelled. It roared louder, hungrier, wilder. The furnace trembled. The iron cracked. The ground beneath their feet shook. Some fell back in fear. Some shouted prayers. Some fled. But Esperanza stood firm. Her eyes glowed in the firelight. Her face illuminated not by reflection, but by something deeper, as though the blaze lived inside her. The crowd looked at her not as a woman, but as something more. Something born of rage, of pain, of fire itself. And now, only one master remained. The final master, the last of the 14, was dragged forward. Senor Rodrigo, the richest among them, the one who had ordered Esperanza's mother, whipped until her body broke. He fell to his knees, choking, weeping. "Please," he sobbed, "spare me. I am old. I cannot bear the pain." Esperanza's gaze burned into him. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then she whispered, "My mother bore it. So will you." The crowd roared. They dragged him toward the furnace. His screams tore through the night as the doors opened one last time. The flames surged outward, white-hot, blinding. The furnace cracked open, spilling light like a volcano, and when Rodrigo was swallowed, the fire did not stop. The curse is born. The flames burst skyward, higher than the cane, higher than the trees, higher than the clouds. The earth shook. The air screamed. And from within the fire, voices rose, not screams, not human cries, but whispers, countless whispers. The voices of the masters, twisted, burning, eternal. Their agony fused with the fire, bound to the furnace, bound to Esperanza. The crowd fell silent, terror-stricken. Some fled into the night, others dropped to their knees, trembling. Esperanza alone stood unmoved. She closed her eyes, lifted her face to the inferno, and breathed. The fire bent toward her, coiling, rapping, as though it recognized its master. When she opened her eyes again, they were not merely glowing. They were flames. Cliffhanger, the fire, consumed the sky, painting the heavens with blood and gold. The plantation was gone. The masters were gone. Only ashes remained, and yet, not gone. The whispers clung to the air. They crawled into the soil. They seeped into the bones of the land. The souls of the 14 had not been destroyed. They had been trapped, bound, cursed, screaming forever in the furnace that had once been their throne. Esperanza turned from the fire at last. Her face was calm. Her people stared, half in awe, half in fear, and in the silence, Esperanza spoke just 3 words: "It is done." But the night was not silent. The fire still whispered. The masters were not gone, and Esperanza's shadow was no longer human. The night was thick, suffocating, as though the air itself conspired to choke the plantation. Smoke coiled low across the fields, mingling with mist, swallowing the sugarcane in a pale shroud. Every shadow seemed alive, twitching, bending, whispering. Inside, the plantation's courtyard, 14 masters, planters, merchants, overseers were gathered. Their boots clicked against the stone as they circled the furnace, a massive iron beast built into the earth, once used for coal and metalwork. The furnace breathed, even without flame, exhaling stale heat and the metallic stench of rust. The men laughed too loudly, their nerves betraying them. The rebellion had caught them off guard. Their cane fields burned, their wealth crumbled, their slaves vanished into the jungle like phantoms, but still, they clung to arrogance. Still, they believed themselves untouchable. Only one woman stood. Before them, Esperanza, her hands bound, wrists bruised, face cut from the scuffle. But her eyes glowed with something unholy. They were not the eyes of a beaten slave. They were the eyes of someone who had already chosen death, and perhaps something worse. "Burn her," one master spat. His voice trembled beneath his anger. "Burn her alive. Let her screams warn the others." The crowd murmured their agreement, but unease festered in their throats. The fire pit was too wide, too deep, too ancient. The villagers whispered it had been built not by colonists but by something older, stone laid by hands no one remembered, an altar disguised as furnace. Esperanza did not resist as they dragged her forward. Chains rattled. Ash crunched underfoot. The men shoved her to the furnace's mouth, where heat rose like breath from some waiting beast. But before they could throw her in, Esperanza spoke. Her voice was soft, steady, cutting through the night. "You think fire destroys," she whispered. "But you are wrong. Fire remembers." The overseer laughed harshly, striking her across the mouth. But her words clung to them like smoke, creeping into their lungs. The furnace growled. Yes, growled. Not the crackle of coal, not the hiss of steam, but the guttural rumble of something waking. The men faltered. Their torches flickered, shadows leaping madly across the walls. "Do it," the captain barked, though his face was pale. "Throw her in." Hands shoved, chains scraped. Esperanza's body disappeared into the mouth of the furnace, and the world stopped. For a heartbeat, there was silence. No laughter, no orders, not even breath. Just the furnace swallowing her whole. Then came the scream, but it wasn't Esperanza's. It was the furnace. A deafening, bone-shaking roar split the night. Sparks exploded upward, blinding the masters, knocking them to their knees. The ground quaked. Cracks spidered across the courtyard stones, glowing with fire beneath. The torches died all at once, leaving only the red pulse of the furnace. Inside the flames, a shape stirred. The men squinted, shielding their eyes, but their terror grew as they saw her. Esperanza, standing inside the inferno. Her chains melted from her wrists like wax. Her flesh did not blister. Her hair streamed upward in the current of flame, a crown of embers, and her eyes, those burning eyes, locked onto them. "You built your wealth on fire," her voice thundered, layered, distorted, as though the furnace itself spoke through her. "Tonight, fire builds on you." The first master screamed. He stumbled backward, tripping over his own feet as the furnace's mouth widened, stretching impossibly like the jaws of some ancient predator. Heat blistered their skin, their fine coats catching flame from the very air. One man tried to run. The ground beneath him split, fire spearing upward, devouring him whole. His scream echoed only for a second before silence swallowed it. Another reached for his musket, but the iron burned red-hot in his hands, melting into his flesh. His cries curdled the night, but the others did not save him. They could not. The furnace roared again, and then it pulled. The air itself shifted, a great, sucking force dragging everything toward the pit. Papers, coins, tools, even stones skittered across the ground, pulled toward the inferno. The men fought it, clinging to walls, to barrels, to each other. But one by one they lost their grip. The furnace wanted them, and the furnace fed. Their bodies slammed into its mouth, limbs thrashing, screams piercing the night before being cut short, replaced by the wet crackle of burning flesh. The smell was unbearable, thick, suffocating, sweet with horror. Inside the furnace, Esperanza raised her arms. The flames bowed outward like wings. Her voice echoed over the chaos. "You will remember me." The courtyard filled with shadows that twisted like living things, faces forming in the smoke, screaming, laughing, whispering curses. The men clawed at the ground, nails breaking, eyes wide with the realization that no prayer, no wealth, no empire would save them. One by one, they vanished into fire, until there was silence again. The furnace pulsed, glowing with the heat of 14. Souls burned alive. The courtyard was a graveyard of ash and blood. Only Esperanza remained, standing within the flames, untouched, unbroken. And then, she was gone. The fire collapsed inward. The furnace closed its jaws. Smoke bled upward, curling into the sky like a black banner. The night held its breath, and those who had watched from the shadows, slaves too frightened to intervene, hiding in the cane fields, felt their terror twist into something else. Hope, because the masters were gone. Burned alive in their own furnace, and the woman who had delivered them, Esperanza, was no longer just flesh and bone. She was fire. But even fire cannot be contained. And in the silence of that cursed courtyard, the furnace began to hum again. Low, steady, hungry, as though it was not finished, as though it was only beginning. The plantation was no longer a place of work, no longer a monument to the master's empire. It had become a graveyard. The furnace stood at its center, a silent beast. Its iron mouth closed now, though faint streams of smoke still curled upward, like whispers. The courtyard, once echoing with orders, whips, and laughter, now lay in ruins. Stones blackened, wood splintered, the very earth scarred with fire. But the silence was the worst part. The silence did not feel like peace. It felt like listening to the earth breathe, waiting for it to exhale again. Those who survived, the slaves who had hidden in the cane fields, trembling in the dark as the massacre unfolded, were the first to creep out. Bare feet pressed lightly against scorched ground. Their eyes darted to every shadow, every ember, terrified that at any moment the furnace would roar again, pulling them too into its maw. But what they saw instead froze them. On the ground, scattered like offerings, were the melted remains of their masters. Boots fused with flesh, buttons of brass warped and bent, jewelry twisted like vines. And the smell, the unbearable choking sweetness of burnt human bodies, hung heavy, refusing to leave, yet there was no body of Esperanza, not a scrap of cloth, not a trace of ash, nothing. It was as though she had been consumed and reborn, the villagers whispered. Some said she had become the fire itself, rising into the night sky as a burning angel. Others swore they had seen her step out of the furnace before it closed, her body cloaked in smoke, her face marked with flame, walking into the cane fields without leaving footprints. But no matter the version, one thing remained the same. Esperanza was no longer human. She was legend. The fear that spread word traveled fast. In the villages beyond the plantation, where slaves worked under different whips, where masters drank their rum and counted their coins, whispers began to spread. They burned her in the furnace, one voice said, trembling. And the furnace burned them instead, another finished. The story slithered through the sugarcane, carried in hushed tones by workers who dared not speak too loudly. Some told it as a warning. The fire is cursed, do not go near it. Others told it with reverence, the fire belongs to her now, she will come for us too and set us free. But even those who believed Esperanza was a savior spoke with fear, because saviors bleed, but fire devours. And no one could be certain what Esperanza had become. At night, when the wind shifted, some claimed they heard screams drifting from the furnace. Not human screams, distorted wails, layered, as if 14 voices cried in agony together. Sometimes the screams turned to laughter, sometimes whispers. One child swore she saw faces in the smoke that rose above the ruins, faces twisted, pleading, clawing at the sky as though trying to escape. And deep in the fields, when the moon was high, workers saw her, Esperanza, or what was left of her. A figure walking through the cane, her body glowing faintly, her hair whipping like fire in an invisible wind. She left no sound, no footsteps, no smell, just heat, enough to wilt the cane leaves around her, enough to make sweat drip instantly from the skin of those who dared glance too long. They said if you looked into her eyes, you would see fire eating away at your own reflection. And if you heard her voice, it would crawl inside your head and stay there. Masters in terror, when news reached the neighboring plantations, fear spread like plague. The masters at first dismissed it, slaves and their ghost stories, they sneered. But at night, when the fires burned low, even they shivered. Because the men who had died were not nameless overseers. They were planters of wealth, merchants of power, men who mattered. And all 14 of them had vanished in a single night, leaving behind only ash. No uprising had ever been so absolute. Some masters abandoned their estates, fleeing into the cities, claiming they had business elsewhere. Others armed themselves, doubling the patrols, fortifying their homes. But nothing stopped the stories, because slaves continued to disappear. At first a few here and there, slipping away into the jungle, then dozens, then whole camps. The overseers searched, but found only burned paths. Cane fields smoldering in the shape of footprints too large, too heavy to belong to any man. The rumors spread. Esperanza is leading them. Esperanza is fire. She will burn them all. And so for the first time, the masters trembled not at rebellion of flesh and blood, but at rebellion born of smoke and shadow. The furnace breathes. Again, weeks passed. The plantation remained abandoned, swallowed slowly by cane and weed. The furnace sat in silence, but silence too can be alive. One evening, when a group of slaves dared to return, to see if the legend was true, they found something waiting. The furnace door was open. No fire burned inside. Only darkness. but the air that rose from it was hot, too hot to be natural. And in that heat was a sound, low and steady, like a heartbeat. Thump, thump, thump. They fled, and that night, smoke rose from the furnace again, black against the stars. Villagers whispered that Esperanza was not gone. She was feeding. The furnace had become her altar, her throne, her mouth. Every soul that burned within it only made her stronger. Some believed she would rise again, leading a war that would consume every master, every plantation, every empire. Others feared she already had. Children of Ashand. Then the sightings began in the jungles. Hunters returned pale, trembling, swearing they had seen things moving among the trees. Figures of smoke with burning eyes, skin like coal, walking without sound. Children of the furnace. They whispered in Esperanza's voice. They carried a fire in their hands. They came at night, slipping into huts, touching walls, leaving behind blackened handprints that smoked until morning. And those who dreamed of them woke with burns on their skin. Was it curse? Was it blessing? No one knew. But the fear was real. The empire had created slaves of flesh. Esperanza had created slaves of fire. Cliffhanger ending. The night grew thick again, as it had on the night of the furnace. Somewhere, deep within the jungle, a fire burned without wood, without smoke, without end. Villagers claimed it was her, Esperanza, sitting cross-legged in the blaze, her eyes closed, her body glowing, feeding on the souls of the men she had taken, waiting. And when the wind shifted, carrying the smell of ash across the land, those who breathed it in swore they heard her voice, not whisper, not scream, but promise, I am not finished. The furnace did not cool. Even when weeks melted into months, its iron belly glowed faintly, as though some unseen breath kept it alive. Those who dared to approach claimed they could hear voices inside, whispers layered upon whispers, not merely the groans of iron, but words, broken and half-formed, as though the dead themselves were trying to speak through smoke. When children were forced to fetch water from the ruined plantation, they came back pale, shaking, their hair smelling of burnt sugar and flesh. They said the ash on the ground moved, forming letters, names, faces. They said the ground itself remembered. And in the dead of night, slaves who had escaped from neighboring estates swore they dreamed of the furnace. Not of fire, not of pain, but of a woman sitting cross-legged within the flame, her eyes two black coals, her skin peeling away into sparks, whispering promises, "Come to me, I will free you, but freedom has a price." These dreams were not random. They spread like plague, one sleeper infecting another, until entire huts woke gasping at once, their lungs filled with smoke that did not exist. Fear gripped them, but so did a dark kind of faith. Because if Esperanza was still whispering, it meant she had not died. And if she had not died, then she had become something greater. It began in secret, in the jungles where the cane fields bled into shadow. Men and women gathered at night, led by whispers they could not explain. They were slaves, runaways, beaten men with scars like maps carved into their skin, women who had buried too many children, youths who had never seen a sunrise without a whip cracking. And at the center of them stood a boy, barely 16, whose skin bore a strange mark, black and burned into his chest, though no fire had touched him. He spoke in a voice not his own, low and steady, words pouring from him as if Esperanza herself was speaking through his lungs. He told them the fire was alive. He told them Esperanza was waiting, not gone, but watching, not flesh but flame. He told them freedom would not come from swords or guns, but from surrender, to her, to the fire, to the ash that remembers. And though some trembled, though some fled, more stayed. They knelt in the dirt. They pressed their foreheads into the ground. They swore they would burn before they bowed again. Thus, the first gathering became the first ritual. No idols, no altars, only ash cupped in their hands, smeared across their brows as they whispered one name, Esperanza. Those who followed her began to change. Their skin darkened not from sun, but from smoke that seemed to cling even after washing. Their eyes gleamed faintly in moonlight, like embers buried beneath ash. Some woke with burns on their arms, shapes that looked like hands pressed into flesh. Others swore they saw shadows moving with them, walking slightly behind, bending slightly ahead, reflections that didn't match their movements. They were no longer merely slaves. They were touched. When they prayed at night, fires would spark without tinder. When they wept, the tears left streaks on the ground like acid. And when they were beaten, because some were captured and dragged back to plantations, their blood sizzled, smoking where it touched the earth. Overseers grew fearful. Rumors spread among the masters. The fire has followers now. The fire walks with them, and in their fear, the masters made their fatal mistake. They punished not one, not 10, but whole groups of suspected followers, hanging them, burning their huts, leaving bodies to rot as warnings. But warnings only fed the legend, because no matter how many they killed, more arose. More whispered the name. More bore the mark. The fire was multiplying. Soon the children began to speak of her. They claimed to see her more often than adults did, as if Esperanza trusted their innocence. She came in dreams, not as fire, but as a woman with hair made of smoke and eyes full of sorrow. She told them secrets they could not have known, names of villages across the island, the hiding places of runaways, the cruelties yet to come. Some children began to wake in the night, walking into the fields without sound, their eyes closed, their lips moving with words not their own. They left trails of ash behind them, though no fire touched the ground. Mothers clutched them, terrified. But the children did not cry. They only whispered, "She is coming. She is not done." Masters grew more afraid of the children than the men, because how do you punish a child who speaks with a dead woman's tongue? And when those same children began to vanish, disappearing from their huts, gone into the jungle without a trace, the fear doubled. Some swore they had seen them again, days later standing among the cane fields, eyes glowing, hands blackened, as though dipped in coal. They were no longer children, they were heralds. The planters gathered in their halls, drinking heavily, sweating even when the nights grew cool. They sent letters to the city, begging for soldiers, priests, anyone who could put down what they now whispered of as a plague. Some called it madness, others called it sorcery. One, drunk on rum and fear, spat out the word no one wanted to speak. "She is a demon." But none of their words stopped the fires that kept breaking out on their land. Flames that moved against the wind, flames that spared huts of the slaves but consumed the masters' homes. Priests were brought, carrying crosses and holy water. But when they approached the furnace, their voices failed, their knees buckled, and their prayers choked on smoke that forced itself into their throats. Soldiers were sent, but many refused to march near the plantation at all. Those who did returned pale, silent, their uniforms singed though no fire had touched them. One shot himself before dawn. The empire was crumbling not from war, but from terror. For terror is an army no musket can kill. And behind it all, Esperanza laughed, or so the slaves claimed, hearing it in the hiss of every flame, the groan of every cane stalk bending in the night wind. Then came the night that would be remembered for generations, the night of ashes. Across 3 plantations, flames erupted at once, not from torches or rebellion, but from the air itself. Cane fields lit like tinder, spreading faster than water could smother, faster than men could flee. The sky turned black with smoke, thick enough to blot out the stars. And in that choking dark, they saw her. Esperanza, walking the fields untouched by flame, her skin glowing as though carved from molten iron, her eyes burning holes into the night. She raised no weapon, she gave no command. Yet slaves broke their chains, seizing whips and blades, cutting down their masters as if driven by something beyond themselves. Those who hesitated claimed they felt her hand on their backs, shoving them forward, whispering in their ears, "Burn, take back what was stolen." The blood of overseers mixed with the ash of Cain until the fields themselves became black rivers. And above it all, Esperanza walked, neither smiling nor weeping, her face unreadable, like the fire itself, destroying and purifying at once. By dawn, there was no question. Esperanza was no longer just a woman, no longer even a spirit. She had become a god. Her followers named themselves the Children of Cinders, and their rituals spread far beyond the island. They carried ash in small cloth pouches tied around their necks. They burned offerings not to heaven, but to the furnace itself. They did not pray for salvation. They prayed for fire. Wherever they went, rebellion followed. Not always victory, but always flames. The empire tried to silence them, branding them heretics, demons, madmen. But you cannot silence fire, you cannot chain smoke, and you cannot kill what is already ash. In the jungles, the children sang songs in whispers, voices trembling with both fear and devotion. They swore they saw Esperanza in the corners of their huts, in the glow of their torches, in the sparks that flew when stone struck metal. She was everywhere. She was waiting. And always, she whispered the same words, "I am not finished." But legends, like fire, do not stay contained. Ships carried sugar and rum to faraway lands, but they also carried whispers of the woman who rose from the furnace, of the masters who burned, of the god of ash who promised freedom in flame. The empire dismissed them as stories at first, but stories can be more dangerous than swords. In ports, sailors swore they smelled smoke where no fire burned. In cities, beggars dreamt of a woman made of fire, promising them vengeance. And in one distant capital, a nobleman woke screaming, his hands blistered, though he had not touched a thing. The fire was spreading, not just through fields, but through minds. Esperanza was no longer bound to the island. She had become something else, an infection, a faith, a shadow in every flicker of flame. And as dawn rose over the blackened ruins, survivors swore they heard her again, her voice echoing in the wind, not in rage, not in sorrow, but in certainty. The world will burn. The ruins of the plantation did not stay silent for long. By dawn, smoke still curled lazily from the blackened furnace, but the cries of the dying had already become rumor, the kind that spread like disease. The villagers whispered that the masters had been pulled into the earth, that their wealth had been swallowed, their bones charred beyond recognition. Yet what unsettled them more was what had not been found. Esperanza. No body, no ashes, no trace of chains. It was as though she had been absorbed into the fire itself. The slaves who had fled the night before returned cautiously, barefoot and trembling, drawn back by both terror and hope. They searched the courtyard in silence, afraid to break whatever curse lingered there. Some found scraps of scorched clothing, others clutched handfuls of black soil that still steamed. But the furnace, oh, the furnace was alive. Its mouth glowed faintly red, not with the chaotic hunger of fresh flames, but with the steady pulse of something that breathed. Every so often it exhaled smoke that drifted upward and curled into shapes, faces screaming, bodies writhing, before unraveling into the pale morning sky. And as the people watched, a sound rose within it, not fire crackling, but whispering, hundreds of voices overlapping, murmuring, indistinct, yet heavy with menace. Some swore they heard the plantation owners crying for release. Others claimed they heard Esperanza's voice, soft and commanding, binding them inside. But all agreed on one thing. The furnace was no longer a tool. It was a tomb, and a mouth still hungry. As night fell again, the whispers thickened. Children woke screaming, saying they had seen figures moving in the mist, their faces melted, their mouths burning with ember light. Women drawing water from the well claimed their reflections flickered, not their own, but gaunt, ash-coated visages staring back. Men who tried to guard the village at night reported footsteps pacing just beyond the tree line, dragging, uneven like burned flesh peeling from bone. And always, when they turned, nothing was there. But the sound persisted, circling them, drawing closer. Fear spread quickly, but so too did reverence. Some began to pray at the edge of the ruined plantation, leaving offerings of food, flowers, even small trinkets scavenged from the abandoned estate. They did not know whether Esperanza had become a saint or a demon, but they knew power when they saw it. And power demanded respect. One old woman, bent and nearly blind, swore she saw Esperanza standing within the furnace as dusk settled, her body wreathed in flame, yet her expression calm, almost sorrowful. "She has not gone," the woman whispered. "She is waiting." That was when the whispers in the furnace changed. They grew louder, sharper, words beginning to form. At first they were in tongues none understood, ancient, guttural, twisting through the air like smoke. But gradually, in the dead of night, the voices began to shape familiar words. Blood, fire, return. The villagers, trembling, realized this was not over. Esperanza's vengeance had not ended with the masters. It had only begun to spread. The plantation itself began to change. What once were cane fields sprouted blackened stalks, sharp as blades, their leaves dripping with tar-like sap. The soil turned brittle, cracked, exuding heat even in rain. Birds avoided the skies above it, their calls falling silent whenever they neared the boundaries. Animals that wandered too close never returned, or returned wrong. A goat stumbled back into the village one morning, its eyes hollow, its fur singed, its bleating warped into something almost human. The villagers slaughtered it in terror, but even its blood sizzled against the ground, as if fire lurked beneath its skin. Children dared each other to approach the furnace's mouth. One boy claimed he saw the faces of the 14 masters pressed against the inner walls, their features distorted, screaming, their hands clawing from within as though the fire itself was glass they could not shatter. Another girl swore Esperanza reached out to her through the flames, her eyes glowing, her lips whispering her name. These stories spread like contagion, and soon no one entered the ruins after sunset. But fear was not enough to keep them away forever. The oppressed needed something more, someone to believe in. Esperanza, who had defied death, had given them that. And the line between horror and worship began to blur. On the 7th night after the burning, the whispers became screams. The furnace roared awake, and the village shook as though the earth itself convulsed. From the ruins, a red glow lit the sky, turning clouds into sheets of blood. Terrified yet compelled, the villagers gathered at the edge of the courtyard. Flames shot upward, but within them they saw visions, shifting, flickering images, a field of broken chains, a city in flames. Ships sinking beneath storm-black seas, empires crumbling into ash, and at the center of it all, Esperanza, her face both radiant and terrible, her eyes bottomless pits of fire. She raised her arms, and the visions split apart, raining sparks over the onlookers. Many fell to their knees, praying, weeping, calling her La Santa de Cenizas, the Saint of Ashes. Others fled into the night, screaming that the world was ending. but no one could deny what they had seen. Esperanza was no longer a woman, she was something more, something that the fire itself had chosen. And as the furnace roared, the villagers realized it was no longer a question of whether she would return. It was a matter of when. In the days that followed, strange plagues spread. Crops withered at the edge of the cursed plantation, while weeds with thorns like knives thrived. Water drawn from nearby streams turned coppery, tasting of blood. Babies were born screaming, their cries eerily resembling the furnace's whispers. Men woke drenched in sweat, claiming they had dreamed of walking into the fire, of feeling Esperanza's hands pull them close, her voice commanding them to burn. Yet alongside this terror, miracles occurred. A woman on the brink of death, her body frail with fever, crawled to the furnace and laid herself against its mouth. She should have been consumed, but when the villagers dragged her back, she stood, skin unmarked, eyes glowing faintly red, her sickness gone. Another claimed his chains dissolved the moment he whispered Esperanza's name within the ruins. These contradictions, plague and miracle, curse and salvation, divided the people. Was she a saint sent to free them, or a demon hungering for sacrifice? Perhaps she was both, and perhaps both were what the world deserved. One night, a group of former overseers who had fled the initial revolt returned with torches and weapons. They had heard the rumors and sought to reclaim the land, to bury the furnace under stone, and rebuild their wealth. But the villagers warned them, begged them not to enter. Arrogance blinded them. They pushed forward anyway. What happened was never fully spoken aloud, but those who watched from the tree line swore they saw shadows peel from the walls, faceless figures crawling across the ground. The overseers screamed, their bodies dragged toward the furnace, though no hands touched. Them their torches died one by one. The last man, running, looked back only once, and his face melted like wax before he even reached the edge of the field. By dawn, nothing remained of them but ash scattered across the courtyard, and the furnace glowed brighter. By now, Esperanza had become more than legend. Songs spread across villages, carried by whispers and drums. Stories told of her burning not 14 men, but hundreds, entire fleets of colonists swallowed by her furnace. Each telling grew darker, more elaborate, until the line between truth and myth vanished. Children played games where they dared each other to whisper into the night, "Esperanza, take me." Lovers carved her name into trees, believing it bound their passion with fire. Even rebels in distant provinces took courage from her story, seeing in her not just a woman, but a weapon, proof that empires could burn. But those closest to the ruins knew the truth. Esperanza was no longer bound by memory. She was alive within the furnace, waiting, hungering, whispering. Her fire spread through rumor, yes, but also through blood, dreams, curses, and faith. And each time someone spoke her name, the furnace pulsed, as though feeding. Then came the night of silence. The furnace, which had groaned, whispered, screamed, for 7 nights straight, suddenly went still. No smoke, no glow, just a yawning black mouth in the earth. The villagers approached with dread, fearing the fire had died, or worse, that it had moved. They gathered around its edge, waiting. Hours passed. The air grew heavy, pressing down on their lungs, making it hard to breathe. Then, just before dawn, a single sound broke the silence. A heartbeat. Slow, deliberate, echoing from deep within. The furnace. Thump. The villagers froze. Thump. Louder now, shaking the stones. Thump. Until the earth split, and from within the black mouth came not flame, but a hand, charred, skeletal, yet wrapped in glowing veins of fire. It gripped the edge of the furnace, pulling upward, and as the villagers screamed and stumbled back, a voice rose from the depths, no longer whispering, no longer human. I have returned. The night was swollen with silence, the kind of silence that feels alive, watchful, brooding, as though the air itself was holding its breath. A thick fog crept in from the marshes, crawling low across the ground, like a ghost reluctant to rise, muffling the world beneath its damp blanket. The plantation stood in uneasy stillness, its hulking structures shrouded in the half-light of a reluctant moon. The air stank of sweat, coal dust, and old blood, the stench of a land that had consumed the lives of too many and digested them into shadows. Esperanza walked across the blackened soil barefoot, her steps neither hurried nor hesitant, but deliberate, like a judge ascending the gallows where her sentence would be read aloud. The coal furnace loomed before her, its belly already glowing faintly red, the embers crackling like the whispers of devils too eager for what was to come. Every step she took was accompanied by the rhythmic creak of the iron chains that hung. From her waist, chains she had stolen from the overseer's shed, not as weapons but as symbols. Tonight, those chains would adorn different wrists. She could hear them inside, the muffled voices of the plantation masters, their arrogance undiminished even in captivity. Some shouted for release, their words sharpened with rage, others begged, their voices trembling in the dark. The blend of their cries was a symphony to her ears, a grotesque orchestra that echoed across the barren fields. The ground seemed to quiver beneath her, as though the earth itself remembered the years of blood spilled upon it, and now, finally, it was ready to drink justice instead. Her breath formed pale mist in the night air as she drew closer to the furnace door, and the first real wave of heat licked across her face, caressing her like an old, wicked lover. She whispered something under her breath, not in Spanish, not in Portuguese, but in the broken tongue of slaves, a prayer of vengeance older than the soil itself. The fog thickened, the flames roared. The night had finally chosen a side. Inside, the furnace chamber. The glow of burning coals painted the walls in shades of living red, like veins pulsing inside the belly of some ancient beast. The masters were bound together, their rich clothes now torn and smeared with soot, their powdered wigs discarded, their finery reduced to rags. Sweat poured down their faces, glistening in the firelight as if their skin had already begun to melt. Their eyes, once sharpened with cruelty and command, now darted like trapped animals searching for escape that did not exist. Esperanza's figure appeared in the doorway, framed by the fire behind her, her silhouette jagged and terrible, half woman, half specter of wrath. For a moment, no one dared speak. It was as though her very presence robbed them of breath, choking them with terror before a single word was uttered. Then one of them, braver or more foolish than the rest, spat toward her feet and cursed her, with words heavy in a European tongue. She did not flinch. Instead, she tilted her head slowly like a predator considering the cries of prey, and her lips parted into something that resembled a smile, but carried none of its warmth. Her eyes reflected the fire, and in their depths was the infinite darkness of every lash, every wound, every child buried in unmarked soil. She walked closer, dragging the iron chains across the stone floor, the clanging echo rising like church bells in a nightmare. The sound drowned the begging voices until only the rhythmic clang remained, steady, merciless. She circled them like a wolf circles lambs. The masters recoiled, trying to twist away from her shadow, but there was no corner that could shelter them. Every heartbeat felt like an hour, every drop of sweat like a countdown. They understood now. This woman did not come with pleas, nor did she carry forgiveness. She came with fire, and the furnace, patient and hungry, was ready to feast. The first scream shattered the air, not from the furnace, but from the whipping lash of memory. Esperanza did not touch them yet. She simply leaned against the furnace wall, feeling its monstrous heart throb with heat, and let silence drown them again. In that silence, Their minds turned on them. One remembered the girl he had beaten until her eyes swelled shut, then sold her at dawn as if she were no more than cattle. Another remembered how he had forced a boy into the furnace years ago as punishment for stealing sugarcane, his laughter echoing as the child burned alive. Now faced with the same glowing mouth of death, that laughter curdled in his throat. Esperanza said nothing. She didn't need to. She simply stared. Her silence was a mirror, and in it they saw every crime replayed in the terrible theater of their own conscience. Some tried to speak, bargain, offer her wealth, offer her freedom. The irony tasted bitter. Freedom from the lips of those who had strangled it in others. Esperanza raised a hand slowly, and the voices stuttered to silence as if unseen fingers gripped their throats. Her hand moved toward the furnace door, and the metal screeched as she pulled it wider, feeding oxygen to the coals. The fire leapt higher, brighter, eager. The sound was like a monstrous exhale, a beast breathing deep before it fed. Their screams began then, not yet of pain, but of terror so thick it crawled into the marrow. One by one they realized what awaited them was not death alone, but death in its most primal, consuming form. The furnace did not simply kill, it erased. Flesh to ash, bone to powder, names to smoke. Esperanza's eyes narrowed, and in a voice low and hollow as the grave, she whispered, "Now, you will know." The furnace roared like some awakened god, its flames twisting upward in frantic tongues that painted the walls in writhing shadows. Esperanza stood motionless, her figure cloaked in both firelight and darkness, and the masters began to tremble as the weight of inevitability pressed down upon them. One of them, his face glistening with oily sweat, broke his bindings in a frenzy of fear and lunged toward her. His voice cracked with desperation. "You don't understand. I was merciful. I spared many of them." His plea was not a confession, but a pitiful attempt to distance himself from the inferno that awaited. Esperanza did not recoil, nor raise a hand in defense. Instead, she stepped aside with the patience of a predator, watching its prey collapse under its own terror. The man stumbled past her, his eyes wild, and came face to face with the open maw of the furnace. The heat struck him like a hammer, stealing the breath from his lungs, blistering his skin within seconds. He fell to his knees, clawing at the stone floor, and screamed, not from Esperanza's wrath, but from the truth of his own cowardice. She did not push him. She did not need to. The furnace's pull was greater than her strength, greater than his will to resist. The man's screams rose higher as the fire claimed him, and for a moment the others dared to believe he had chosen to end it himself. But Esperanza knew better. It was the furnace itself, hungry, insatiable, that had drawn him in. The rest recoiled in horror, their cries colliding into a chorus of madness, while the stench of burning flesh crawled across the chamber like invisible smoke fingers reaching for their throats. Esperanza lowered her gaze, her voice barely audible, yet sharp enough to slice through their terror. "The fire takes what it is owed." The words echoed like a curse, bouncing off the stone walls and sinking into their ears until it seemed the very air was whispering it back. The chamber now smelled of charred humanity, a stench that clung to every breath, searing the lungs of those still alive. Their coughing and sobbing filled the hollow furnace room, but Esperanza did not falter. She paced slowly around them, dragging the iron chains against the floor in long, screeching strokes, each metallic shriek cutting into their nerves. Shadows of the chains danced grotesquely across the walls, writhing like snakes alive with venom. The captives could not look away. The noise was maddening, the sound of their own impending shackles being written into reality. One man, older than the rest, his face carved with lines of greed and cruelty, dared to spit words through his terror. You are a demon. No woman could do this. His voice cracked under the weight of his own disbelief. Esperanza stopped pacing and turned toward him, her movements deliberate, almost theatrical. For a heartbeat, silence reclaimed the chamber, save for the hiss of the fire. She leaned closer to him, her shadow swallowing his trembling frame. Her whisper cut through his words, each syllable drenched in venom. No woman? Then perhaps it is the devil himself you created. His face blanched, his lips quivered, but no sound came. He could not argue, he could not beg. In that moment, the truth bared itself cruelly. This was not a demon born from hell, but one carved by their own hands, from their whips, their chains, their greed, their cruelty. The very monster they feared was nothing more than their reflection, wearing flesh. Esperanza raised her hand and struck the furnace door with the chain. The clang rang like thunder and sparks burst upward in a shower of flame. The captives flinched as if the fire had leapt for their throats, their minds already unraveling under the weight of terror. And Esperanza smiled, not in joy, but in grim satisfaction. She had not yet touched them, yet already the fire was devouring their sanity. The chamber had become a tomb of heat and silence, broken only by the ragged breath of the plantation masters and the relentless growl of the furnace. Esperanza stood at its mouth, her figure drenched in firelight like a statue carved from vengeance itself. Every flicker of flame painted her with shadows that seemed to shift and coil, as if the fire itself bent to her will. The masters could barely meet her gaze, their bodies trembling with exhaustion, their lips cracked from thirst, their minds unraveling under the relentless assault of smoke and dread. The air was thick, so thick it clung to their throats, tasted of ash, and seared their lungs like a poison. In that suffocating silence, Esperanza moved, slow and deliberate, her chains dragging across the stone floor with a metallic scream that tore into their nerves. The sound was unbearable, and yet they could not stop listening. It was the sound of inevitability, the herald of their doom. One of the younger men finally broke, collapsing to his knees. His voice cracked like a child's. "Please, I beg you, spare me." His sobs shook the chamber, but Esperanza did not falter. She lowered her head slightly, her voice so soft it seemed almost compassionate. "Did they beg you?" The words landed like a knife, and the man's sobs twisted into screams, for he understood what she meant. She was not merely their executioner, she was their mirror. And in her presence, their sins were reflected back with blinding clarity. The furnace growled louder, as if hungry for his body, and the others recoiled, pressing themselves against the stone walls as though they could melt into it, vanish, escape. But there was no escape here. The chamber itself had become alive, breathing, pulsing, waiting for their screams to feed it. The older masters tried to cling to reason, muttering to themselves that this was a nightmare, that they would wake in their beds with the sea wind brushing their curtains. But each second made that illusion crumble. The firelight revealed too much. Every bead of sweat, every tear, every crack in the stone beneath them, glowing faintly red as though the earth itself were heating, conspiring with Esperanza. The men began whispering among themselves, their voices jagged, broken by sobs. They spoke not of survival, but of betrayal, of which one among them deserved to burn first. "It was him," one shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at another. "He was the cruelest." The accused lunged forward, spitting, "Liar, you whipped them more than any of us." The chamber dissolved into chaos, their aristocratic masks shattering completely as they clawed at one another, desperate to deflect fate. Esperanza watched with cold detachment, her lips curled into the faintest trace of disdain. Their unity had dissolved, their greed, their cruelty, their cowardice had devoured them before the fire ever would. Slowly, she raised her hand, and The furnace roared louder, drowning their arguments in its thunder. The sound silenced them at once, pressing their throats shut with its heat. Esperanza's eyes gleamed with something far more terrifying than anger. It was purpose. She whispered almost lovingly, "You will burn together, as you lived together, bound by your sins." And in that moment the men understood. They would not escape one another. The fire would not allow them the mercy of solitude. The air grew hotter still, blistering, until even the stone walls began to sweat. The masters cried out in agony, their skin reddening, blistering from nothing more than proximity to the furnace. They huddled together, their pride shattered, their dignity gone, reduced to animals awaiting slaughter. One of them, delirious with heat and terror, began to laugh. The sound was cracked, jagged, hysterical, bouncing off the stone walls like a broken hymn. His laughter rose until it overpowered the sobs of the others, and then, just as suddenly as it began, it stopped, choked off by a scream as he collapsed face first into the stone. The stench of scorched flesh filled the chamber, and the others, gagged, retching, but could not look away. Esperanza stepped forward, her chains dragging close to his twitching body. She knelt beside him, her face inches from his, and for a fleeting moment she looked almost tender. Then she whispered in his ear, words no one else could hear, and with one slow, deliberate push, she rolled him toward the furnace's open mouth. His body hit the iron edge, and the flames surged as though in ecstasy, pulling him in with a greedy hiss. His scream lasted only a moment before it was devoured completely. The fire snapped, crackled, spat sparks across the floor as if savoring its feast. The surviving masters clutched each other in horror, unable to comprehend how quickly one of their own had been swallowed whole. Esperanza rose again, her shadow stretching tall against the wall, and said, almost in a whisper, "The fire remembers." The chamber now reeked of burning flesh and despair. Smoke curled thick in the air, staining their lungs, making every breath a battle. The surviving masters coughed violently, their eyes streaming tears. But Esperanza stood unaffected, her face set in grim resolve. She turned her gaze to the ceiling, where cracks had begun to form, leaking faint streams of light from the world above. The plantation, the wealth, the empire, they all lay up there, blind to what was happening beneath their feet. And here, in this chamber of fire and vengeance, history was being rewritten in screams. Esperanza closed her eyes, inhaling deeply as though the smoke carried with it the voices of the enslaved. When she opened them again, her expression was transformed, not rage, not satisfaction, but something colder, more terrifying, inevitability. She began to chant again, her voice low at first, then rising with each syllable, the words echoing as though spoken by many throats at once. The masters writhed at the sound, their ears ringing, their hearts pounding. It was no language they knew, yet its meaning was undeniable. It was a summons, a judgment. The furnace answered with a deafening roar, the flames surging so high they licked the ceiling. Shadows of screaming faces danced in the firelight, the ghosts of those who had perished, now awakened, now watching. The masters could no longer contain themselves. They screamed, begged, groveled at her feet. "We will give you gold, freedom, land," they howled, but Esperanza only shook her head. Her whisper was barely audible over the roar, "You cannot buy back the dead." Desperation twisted the men into madness. One of them lunged suddenly at Esperanza, his bound wrists bleeding from where he had torn at the ropes. His teeth snapped. Toward her like a rabid dog, his eyes wide with insanity. But before he could touch her, the chains at her waist swung like a living serpent, wrapping around his throat. His scream was cut off as the iron tightened, dragging him backward. The others shrieked as the man was yanked across the floor, his fingernails scraping bloody lines into the stone. The furnace pulled at him, its glow intensifying until with one final violent jerk, he was consumed. The flames roared higher, their heat slamming into the remaining men like a wave. Esperanza stood unmoving, the chain sliding back into her hand as though it had never left. Her eyes, glimmering with reflected firelight, swept across the survivors, pinning them in place. None dared to move. None dared to breathe too loudly. In that silence, Esperanza spoke with words that carried the weight of centuries. Every scream is a brick torn from your empire. Every flame is a stone stolen from your throne. The men sobbed openly now, their arrogance burned away, their bodies trembling like children before a storm. They were no longer masters. They were prisoners awaiting execution, pawns in a ritual they could not understand, a ritual that would not end until the fire had devoured every last one. The chamber itself seemed to close in on them, the walls glowing faintly red, as though the stone had begun to bleed. The sound of the furnace grew unbearable, a steady roar punctuated by sudden snaps that sounded like bones breaking. The masters pressed themselves against the walls, clawing at the cracks trying to find a way out. Their fingernails split, their fingers bled, but the stone did not yield. It was as if the chamber had sealed itself, trapping them as surely as Esperanza's chains. Their screams rose again, this time directed not at her, but at God, pleading for salvation. But no answer came, only the endless roar of the furnace. Esperanza moved among them, her shadow cast enormous by the flames, her presence suffocating. She did not speak this time. She only looked at them, her silence more dreadful than words. Each master tried to avoid her gaze, but when her eyes met theirs, they felt stripped bare, their sins laid open, their humanity torn away. It was not her vengeance they saw, it was their own guilt, reflected back at them with merciless clarity. And as the firelight writhed across the walls, each man began to see things, faces of the enslaved they had beaten, women they had violated, children they had torn from mothers' arms. The faces screamed at them, clawed at them, mocked them. The chamber had become not only their tomb, but their judgment hall. Their own minds were betraying them, burning them from within before the flames could touch their flesh. The night stretched over the plantation like a suffocating cloak, starless, merciless, as though the heavens themselves had turned their gaze away. Inside the furnace chamber, the fire had grown monstrous, its glow no longer red but a searing white, its roar vibrating the very stone foundation. The air was molten, thick with smoke and the stench of charred bodies. Yet Esperanza stood unflinching at the center, her silhouette carved in firelight, her shadow tall and jagged upon the walls like some colossal phantom. Around her, the bound masters were dissolving into hysteria, their voices broken into pleas, curses and incoherent rambling. Their arrogance had long been burned away, leaving only raw fear. One screamed that he would give her gold, another that he would free every slave he owned, while another clawed at his own flesh, begging the furnace to spare him. Their words collided, twisted, and melted into a cacophony that sounded less like men and more like the screeching of beasts in a slaughterhouse. Esperanza did not respond. Her silence was heavier than any words, a silence that pressed upon their skulls until their madness spilled over. The only voice that mattered in the room was the furnace itself, hissing, breathing, hungering. Esperanza moved slowly toward them, dragging the iron chain across the floor. The sound was deliberate. Screech, pause, screech, pause, each stroke carving terror deeper into their bones. Her eyes locked on the youngest among them, a plantation heir barely older than a boy, whose trembling lips whispered prayers to a God that had never answered the cries of the enslaved. His voice cracked as he begged, "Please, please, I wasn't like them. I didn't whip anyone." Esperanza stopped in front of him, her face half lit by the flames, her expression unreadable. She leaned closer, so close that he could see the reflection of the fire in her pupils, and whispered, "And yet you ate their bread. You drank their blood in silence." The boy's eyes widened with horror, as though her words alone had sentenced him. She stood upright again and turned her back on him, not out of mercy, but because his fate was already sealed. The furnace would not care for degrees of guilt. It demanded blood, and all of them reeked of it. The boy sobbed louder, his cries piercing the chamber, but Esperanza never looked back. The fire surged suddenly, as if provoked by her silence, and from within its blazing core came a sound no living man should ever hear. A shriek, layered with thousands of voices, the wails of the enslaved who had perished under lash, hunger, and sickness. Their agony did not fade into the flames. It had been stored, nourished, and now poured out with fury. The masters collapsed into silence, their mouths hanging open in horror as the sound clawed into their souls. Their crimes had come alive, no longer memory, no longer hidden in the soil or in the torn flesh of their victims. Esperanza closed her eyes and raised her arms as if conducting a symphony of the damned, her voice rising in chant. Each word she spoke was ancient, borrowed from tongues outlawed by their whips, whispered in the dark by mothers to their children before they were sold, carved into the blood-soaked earth by nameless rebels who had fallen before her. The chamber shook. Dust fell from the ceiling. The chains rattled as though alive. And in the midst of it all, the captives felt the line blur between the furnace and hell itself. The oldest master, his beard singed by the heat, suddenly broke free from his paralysis and hurled himself at Esperanza, teeth bared like a cornered animal. His attack was not bravery, but the final convulsion of a dying beast. Esperanza did not move. The furnace itself seemed to answer in her stead. A whip of flame burst outward, licking across his face, burning his skin into a mask of bubbling flesh. His scream echoed raw and ragged as he stumbled blindly, clutching his face before collapsing at her feet. The others recoiled in horror, realizing the fire itself bent to her will. Or perhaps she bent to its will, the line too thin to see. Esperanza looked down at the smoldering figure and spoke only one word, low and steady. Judged. The word rang louder than the scream, louder than the fire, filling every corner of the room. The masters shrank back, for they understood that each of them would hear that word before the night ended. Time dissolved. The chamber was no longer a place of stone and iron, but a theater of damnation, where the audience and the actors were one and the same. Each heartbeat of the fire became a drumbeat of death. Esperanza began circling them once more, her chain dragging behind her, its rhythm syncing with the furnace's breath. One of the women, an overseer's wife who had come to witness the rebellion's punishment, but had instead been seized, collapsed onto her knees, sobbing, clutching at Esperanza's dress. "Please," she wailed. "I only watched. I never raised a whip." Esperanza lowered her gaze to her, and in that flicker of firelight, her face seemed both human and inhuman, angel and demon. Her words fell like stones into the woman's ears. "The eyes that watched in silence are the hands that tied the knots." She shoved the woman back, her body striking the stone floor with a hollow crack. The furnace flared higher, swallowing her cries. The other captives screamed louder now, each of them realizing there was no escape, no mercy, no bargaining. Their wealth, their power, their titles, none of it meant anything here. In this chamber, they were prey. The voices of the dead swelled again, and this time the fire projected visions into the room. The masters saw the faces of those they had killed, the mothers whipped to death, the children starved, the men who fell under endless labor. Each ghostly image rose from the fire, their mouths open in silent screams, their eyes locked on their tormentors. The captives howled, thrashing against their bonds as though trying to claw their way out of reality itself. One master bit his own tongue until blood gushed, desperate to wake from what he thought was a nightmare. But there was no waking. This was truth made flesh, vengeance made flame. Esperanza stood among the apparitions, her body glowing with the reflection of the fire, as though she herself had become part of the vision. The dead swirled around her like a crown of fire, and the living understood with horror that she was not alone. She was the vessel, and every lash, every scream, every drop of blood she'd had filled her until this night, when the vessel overflowed. By now, the heat was unbearable. The stone walls wept with condensation, the air rippled like liquid, and the captive's skin blistered merely from breathing. Yet Esperanza's movements remained slow, deliberate, inhumanly calm. She approached the furnace once more, her chains scraping across the floor, and pressed her palm against the iron door. A low groan shuddered through the chamber as the furnace opened wider, its light searing, blinding, swallowing all shadows. The captives wailed, some begging, some reciting prayers, others clawing their faces until nails tore through skin. Esperanza turned back to them, her face lit in stark relief. She raised the chain high, and for a heartbeat silence fell, so complete that even the furnace seemed to pause. Then she spoke, her voice ringing like iron striking iron. "The fire will take you one by one, and the earth will never remember your names." With that, the silence shattered. The chain cracked against the floor, and the fire surged outward, its heat-curling hair, blistering eyes, as though it was already reaching to drag them inside. The chamber erupted into chaos. Screams clashed against the roar of the furnace. Chains rattled violently as captives tried to flee bonds that would never break. The floor itself seemed to quake, the stone trembling under the weight of fury, older than their bones. Esperanza stood unmoving, framed by the white inferno, her figure a silhouette carved from vengeance itself. The dead still screamed from the flames, their chorus growing louder until it was impossible to tell whether the cries belonged to the damned inside the furnace or those about to join them. The masters' bodies shook violently, their sanity snapping one by one until madness replaced fear. Some laughed, others shrieked confessions to crimes no one would hear. Esperanza raised the chain once more, her gaze sweeping across them, and whispered a final sentence that froze their blood. "Tonight, the fire remembers." The furnace roared higher, a beast unleashed, and the chamber became a theater of blood and flame. The furnace door yawned wide like the mouth of an ancient beast, its core blazing with a light so violent it erased all color from the chamber. Only white fire remained, a light that scalded the eyes and stripped away illusions of flesh and bone. The captives screamed as if already burning, their voices breaking into jagged sobs. The iron chains that held them began to heat, glowing faintly, sizzling against their skin. Their struggles became grotesque dances of agony, flesh blistering where the metal kissed them. Esperanza stood before the furnace as its priestess and executioner, her silhouette a black cutout against the searing glow. She lifted the iron chain she carried and let it drag across the floor with a sharp clang, summoning silence like a gavel calling order in a court of eternal law. Her voice, when it came, was calm, steady, stripped of rage or pity. "The fire does not lie. It takes only what it is owed." The first victim was chosen without ceremony. The oldest master, his face already a grotesque ruin of burned flesh, was dragged forward by invisible force, as though the fire itself had laid claim to him. His body writhed, heels scraping furrows into the stone floor, his hands clawing desperately at air. The furnace exhaled, a surge of heat that made the chamber tremble, and then inhaled, pulling him forward. His scream tore the air as he was yanked inside. For a moment his body convulsed in the white light, his outline warping, flesh melting, from bone in an instant. Then he was gone. The chamber fell silent except for the furnace's hiss, like a beast satisfied with its first morsel. The others collapsed against their restraints, eyes wild, breath shuddering, for they knew the fire's hunger had only just begun. One by one, the furnace claimed them. The overseer's wife was next, dragged across the stone as she shrieked for forgiveness. She clawed her face bloody, screaming prayers, but Esperanza's eyes never softened. When the furnace swallowed her, her screams merged with the wails of the dead inside, until her voice was indistinguishable among the damned. The boy, the heir who had begged mercy, was dragged last. His youth did not save him, it damned him further. As he neared the furnace, his body convulsed with terror, and his voice cracked, crying, "I'm not like them, please." Esperanza stepped forward at last, crouched to his level and whispered, "You are their blood." His face broke into hopeless tears before the fire took him, devouring his words and body alike. Each death seemed to fuel the fire, which roared higher, shaking the walls. The furnace door now gaped like the mouth of hell itself, its glow spilling across the chamber, washing away all shadows. Ghostly faces swirled in the flames, men, women, children, the enslaved whose suffering had been buried in silence. They screamed not in torment now, but in triumph, their voices rising into a deafening chorus that filled the chamber and spilled into the night beyond the plantation. Outside, the earth trembled. Windows shattered. Livestock screamed in terror. Those still alive on the plantation dropped to their knees, clutching their heads, hearing the roar of vengeance carried on the wind. At last, when the final master was dragged screaming into the furnace, Esperanza remained standing in the silence that followed. The chamber was scorched black, stone cracked, air shimmering with unbearable heat. The fire did not die. It burned stronger than ever, but now its rage had calmed into steady breath, as though satiated. Esperanza lowered her chain. Her eyes, once human, now glowed faintly with the reflection of the flames, as if part of her soul had fused with them. She whispered, not to the living, but to the countless dead who had borne witness, "It is finished." The fire rumbled, low and resonant, like thunder buried beneath the earth, and for the first time that night the chamber felt almost still. But, as Esperanza turned to leave, the furnace gave a final violent surge. Its roar shattered stone, spraying fragments across the chamber. For one heartbeat, it seemed the fire would consume her too, but instead it recoiled, bowing back into its core as though recognizing her as its chosen vessel. The dead whispered her name in 1,000 voices, carrying it on the smoke. Esperanza stepped through the collapsing doorway, her figure framed by the white inferno behind her. Outside, the night wind rushed against her face, carrying the scent of ash and blood. The plantation, once a monument to cruelty, now stood on trembling ground, its buildings groaning as though ready to collapse. Behind her, the furnace roared, one last time, sending a column of flame into the sky, a beacon of vengeance visible for miles. Every soul who saw it that night would remember, and those who had once ruled by the lash would whisper of Esperanza, not as a woman, but as the fire itself. When dawn finally touched the horizon, the plantation was no longer a place of life, but a graveyard of blackened ruins. Smoke twisted into the sky like skeletal fingers reaching for heaven, carrying with it the stench of charred flesh and scorched earth. The once proud manor house stood gutted, its windows blown out, walls caving inward, roof sagging as though the weight of centuries of cruelty had finally collapsed upon it. The sugarcane fields smoldered, their tall stalks reduced to embers, whispering with the crackle of dying fire. No birds sang, no insect stirred. The plantation was silent, except for the faint hiss of cooling ash. Survivors, those few slaves and workers who had not been caught in the chaos, moved cautiously through the wreckage, eyes wide, bodies trembling. They whispered Esperanza's name as both prayer and curse, afraid to speak too loudly, as though the fire still listened. The furnace, the heart of the horror, remained standing amid the ruins. Its door had fused shut, its iron warped and glowing faintly with unnatural heat, as though something inside still lived. No one dared approach it. Some swore they heard faint screams echoing from within, not of agony, but of endless pleading. The wind carried those whispers down into the valleys and across the hills, spreading the tale faster than any messenger could. By midday, neighboring plantations were already murmuring of the inferno, of how 14 masters had been burned, alive by their own fire, and of the woman who commanded it. Mothers hushed their children with the story, not as warning, but as reverence. Esperanza de Lima was no longer merely a name. She had become a force, a ghost that lived in every flicker of flame. But Esperanza herself was gone. No one saw her leave, no one saw her fall. Some claimed she walked into the dawn barefoot, her dress scorched but her body untouched, vanishing into the sugarcane like smoke. Others swore they saw her step directly into the furnace as it erupted, her body dissolving into white fire, merging with the inferno itself. And some, the most superstitious, whispered that she had not left at all, that she still wandered the ruins, her figure appearing at the edge of vision, her chains dragging against the stone, her eyes glowing faintly in the dark. The uncertainty only deepened her legend. To the oppressed, she was salvation incarnate. To the powerful, she was terror itself, proof that cruelty would one day demand a price no wealth could repay. Weeks passed, and the plantation's land was abandoned. Grass grew over the ruins, weeds swallowed the paths, and the furnace remained, always warm to the touch, never cold, never dead. Travelers who dared to pass at night swore the air shimmered with heat, though no fire burned. Some returned claiming to have heard chains dragging through the ash, others insisting they had seen figures writhing inside the furnace door, as if trapped in an eternal burn. Local priests attempted to consecrate the ground, but their holy water boiled in their hands and they fled, trembling. Over time, the site became forbidden, a scar on the land. No one built upon it, no one tilled the soil. It was said the ashes themselves remembered the screams, and if disturbed, they would rise again. Generations later, the story of Esperanza de Lima was still told. Some called her a martyr, others a witch. Her name carried both dread and hope, depending on who whispered it. Fireside tales told of her appearing whenever cruelty grew too great, standing at the edge of the fields, silent, watching, waiting. Children dared each other to stare into flames, claiming that if they looked long enough, her face would appear in the embers. And when plantation owners elsewhere heard of unrest, they muttered her name with unease, glancing toward their furnaces. At night, half expecting the door to creak open on its own. Esperanza had become eternal, not as flesh but as story, as fear, as fire. Yet some claimed the legend was not only metaphor. Strange disappearances were whispered across the island. Overseers vanishing without trace, found days later burned to bone, though no fire had touched the land around them. Villagers told of furnaces that roared to life in the dead of night, though no coal had been laid inside. In the white glow of those impossible flames, a woman's shadow moved, tall, steady, dragging chains that sparked across the stone. Those who claimed to have seen her up close said her eyes were not human at all, but burning coals that flickered with the reflection of countless screaming faces. Whether true or born of terror, such stories spread like fire itself, ensuring Esperanza de Lima would never die. One final tale lingers among the ashes. They say that on certain nights, when the wind is right, the furnace still exhales. Smoke rises, thick and black, curling into the sky. If one listens closely, the smoke carries voices, not screams but chants. The cries of the enslaved rising in unison, echoing Esperanza's vengeance. Some who dared to stand close swear the smoke took shape, forming her silhouette, her chain raised, her head bowed. And in those moments, the furnace does not seem like a ruin, but a doorway, open, waiting, hungry. Those who linger too long at its threshold often vanish, leaving only the smell of burnt flesh behind. Thus ended the tale of the woman who burned 14 masters alive. Yet thus, it never ended at all. For legends are not bound by death, and fire does not ask permission to spread. Esperanza de Lima was more than a woman. She was the vengeance of the voiceless, the reckoning born of centuries of suffering. The plantation fell, but the memory did not. And so long as fire exists, so long as flames consume wood, coal, or flesh, her story lives. Somewhere in the crackle of every fire one might hear it. The dragging of a chain, the hiss of heat, the whisper of a woman's voice carried on the smoke. The fire does not lie. It takes only what it is owed.